Thank you everyone for joining from throughout the world, and welcome to today's webinar, Greenwashing, Unrooting the Jewish National Fund. My name is Erez Bleacher, and I'm a member of the Green Olive Collective, a binational advocacy, education, and tour guiding cooperative committed to a democratic future in Israel-Palestine, an end to the occupation, and an end to the ongoing displacement of Palestinians. The Green Olive Collective has over 400 members around the world, and I'm very glad to see so many of you here with us tonight. Welcome. Tonight's event is, of course, free and open to the public as part of our ongoing commitment to accessible education and advocacy in defense of human rights. But of course, there are costs associated with the event. If you'd like to help cover the costs, it would be phenomenal and much appreciated. And you can contribute whatever you choose at the following link, greenolivetours.com/contributions, which I'll also send in the chat right now. Your contributions will go to compensate our expert speakers today, to sustain future publicly accessible Green Olive initiatives, and 10% of all proceeds from this event will go to a truly incredible organization, the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which provides healthcare for children in Gaza and is currently developing a pediatric cardiac surgery program in Khan Yunis in Gaza, which is incredible. I'm also very excited to say that today's event is co-sponsored with If Not Now, a movement of American Jews organizing their community to end their support for Israel's apartheid system and demand equality, justice, and a thriving future for all Palestinians and Israelis. We're very proud, I'm sure I can say on behalf of all of the Green Olive Collective, to have with us our speakers at this event and for this webinar, Daniel Roth and Maya Rosen, who will share their scholarship and critical perspective about the Jewish National Fund. Daniel and Maya are both long-standing human rights and solidarity activists. Daniel is currently the director of the Center for Jewish Nonviolence, and Maya is a graduate student in history after working for many years in human rights organizations, including Breaking the Silence. I've been honored to know both of them in many capacities, including in campaigns to oppose the JNF's expropriation of Palestinian land in the Negev, such as in villages like Al-Khiran and Al-Arqib, and across the Green Line in the West Bank. I'm also particularly excited to have them here because, and this is a little bit more on a somber note, but because as we've worked against the expropriation of Palestinian land and stood with communities who are facing potential eviction and demolition, we've come to understand that the Jewish National Fund is not only essentially implicated in the displacement of people from land, but implicated in the displacement and dislocation of identity, memory, and meaning itself in Israel-Palestine, which I'm sure will become more apparent and illuminated upon during the course of this conversation. So I'm really delighted and glad and appreciative to have Daniel and Maya with us, giving their time and sharing their expertise, both about the workings of the Jewish National Fund and about the reasons it's so important and urgent for all of us who are concerned with human rights to counter the greenwashing of the Jewish National Fund. Ultimately, before I'm going to pass it over to Daniel and Maya in a moment, I think it's important as we head into today's conversation, which can seem abstract sometimes to those of us who aren't directly affected and who are meeting in Zoom webinars and in settings such as this, that people's lives and communities are truly on the line. People's childhoods and elderly years are at stake, their subsistences are at stake. And so it's actually very meaningful and powerful that a group of people like us are bringing ourselves to this conversation and to the conversation around justice in Israel-Palestine. I should say one last thing before turning it over to Maya and Daniel, is that we're going to open it up to them now to share their wisdom and their words and their findings after their research around the Jewish National Fund this last year. And then afterwards, we'll open up the conversation for questions and answers. But from this moment on, everyone should please feel free to send questions you have and questions that come up during the presentation into the chat. Maybe it'd be helpful if you just wrote question and then wrote your question so we can easily see it. And then we'll integrate the questions you send throughout the conversation into the question and answer period at the end. So with that, I'll pass it over to Maya and Daniel, who should be able to join and be with us. Are you here?
We're here.
We are here. Hello, hello.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you to Erez and to Green Olive. It's really great to be here and to be speaking with all of you about a topic that we both really care about a lot. So I just want to say a few words in terms of introduction about how this research and how our work around the JNF came to be. Daniel and I both grew up with the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, as a central institution in our lives, in our communities, in our childhoods. And it was something that was presented to us as a fairly apolitical environmental organization. The JNF has these ubiquitous blue boxes, they're called. You can see the image now on your screens. And putting money into the blue box was something that was sort of a staple of our childhood. And I remember one of the first times that I was ever in an activist context in the South Hebron Hills of the West Bank. I was in a Palestinian village. I was in a area that was a Palestinian village that had been taken over by a settlement called Susia. And there was a plaque there that the building had been a donation from the Jewish National Fund. And I remember thinking to myself how surprising that was, that this organization that I associated with environmental action had this plaque in a settlement. And that was sort of the basis of thinking around the JNF and starting to have an understanding that what they were up to was something beyond apolitical environmental work. Daniel and I have now, in the many years since then, in various capacities in our activist work, have seen some of the really devastating effects of the JNF on Palestinian communities on both sides of the Green Line. And what spurred this report in particular that we wrote, and which we are presenting a condensed version of tonight, is a vote that happened in February of last year, where the Jewish National Fund voted on whether it would formalize a policy of purchasing land for Israel in the West Bank. And there was a lot of uproar around that vote, and a lot of people on the left sort of woke up a little bit to the JNF and to some of the devastation that it's been wreaking. And our conclusion from that, we did some organizing around that vote in particular, but I think coming out of that, we realized we actually need to understand the JNF much more in depth. That the JNF is this massive institution that has a tremendous amount of power and has really devastating consequences to its work. And we realized that we didn't understand it sufficiently, and that we didn't think the left in general did, and that we wanted to actually have a much more strategic approach to how to counter their work in conversation with affected communities, with other activists on the ground and abroad. And so that sort of spurred our research together. The report itself has three main parts. The first section focuses on how the work of the Jewish National Fund entrenches the occupation and apartheid and discrimination. The second part is about how the opacity of this enormous and old institution actually functions. What are the institutions at play? And the third section is what progressives are able to do to counter these problematic effects. And so our presentation tonight will generally kind of follow those three main categories.
Yeah, and I guess just one technical note, Kakal JNF is, we might say Kakal, we might say JNF, we might say Kakal JNF. Kakal is the acronym in Hebrew, Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael. We may use them interchangeably tonight, but the sort of full name is Kakal JNF. So the JNF was founded in 1901 at the Fifth Zionist Congress, which is an international meeting of Zionist organizations that still actually takes place today, and it's still central to Kakal's power structures. We'll explain a little more about what that means and what that looks like later, and the report goes much more into depth, in depth about that. And its founding mission was to purchase land in Palestine and surrounding areas on behalf of the Jewish people. Cacao is very, very big. It owns 13% of the land in Israel, and it had an expected gross revenue of over 1.2 billion shekel for 2021. It's got over 1,000 employees and 50 offices around the world, primarily working on fundraising. But it's not just big in those terms. It's also deeply, deeply important in the last century plus 120 years or so. It has developed into an institution that holds an important place in Jewish communal consciousness. I think a lot of what Maya was just describing and as our upbringing is a pretty common story. And it's very identified with environmentalism and intercommunal grassroots support for Jewish communities in Israel in particular. It's important to say, I think it's most famous for tree planting, but Cacao is also an enormous real estate and fundraising body. Real estate, though, people may know it for tree planting and may know some of the fundraising efforts that go on perhaps in your communities, but the real estate far outweighs the fundraising overall. And to Cacao JNF in Israel and to international JNFs, it's even less of a factor in terms of their overall budget. What we found was that in 2019, the JNF's revenue was 2 billion shekel, and 84% of that came from profit from real estate holdings, which is managed by the Israel Land Authority. 84% again. So compare that to 4.5% that came from donations. The rest came from partnerships with the government and other institutions. Moving forward, attempting to move the slide forward. I'm having there you go. So this past year, the current chair of Cacao JNF said it's nonsense to say that Cacao has not operated in Judea and Samaria before. Judea and Samaria, another term for the West Bank or the occupied Palestinian territories. What we found is that he's absolutely correct. Since its inception, Cacao has aimed to support Jewish settlement in Israel, Palestine, and has done so through the dual tactics of purchasing land and strategic environmental projects. And both of these undertakings have contributed to the intentional displacement and erasure of Palestinian communities, which continues to this day on both sides of the Green Line. Importantly, this has been true since the early years of the state. A major example of this that we found is that the state transferred Palestinian refugee land in the years following 1948, the establishment of the state of Israel, the Nakba, to Cacao in order to avoid having to give back that land in line with UN resolutions that called for that. So about 1.5 million of 2.5 million dunam of the land that Cacao holds was taken from refugees. The land holdings are central to their power and sort of that full picture of their real estate holdings that I just described. And just to give a little bit of a background of where we found that, someone named Amiad Niv, who served as the head of Cacao's research institute, wrote in a Cacao publication that this is a quote, during the early years of the state's existence, the government headed by David Ben-Gurion decided to, quote, to redeem additional areas of land and to transfer them to Cacao JNF's guardianship with the goal of preventing the return of those who had held the land before the foundation of the state.
So to continue on this idea of sort of the strategic use of Cacao JNF by the state It's important when we think about Kakal JNF's history of purchasing land in the West Bank to note that JNF has been doing this, purchasing land in occupied territory, since at least 1968, the very first year of the 1967 occupation, when then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol requested that JNF specifically purchase land in the West Bank as part of strategic government policy. This has continued in the decades since then. In the 1970s, JNF established what's called a subsidiary company called Himanuta, with the purpose of purchasing land in the West Bank. In the mid-1980s, Kakal JNF began a series of partnerships with two far-right settler groups in East Jerusalem called Elad and Ateret Kohanim, both of which work to advance the Judaization of East Jerusalem and various settlement projects in that area. And in 2014, an Israeli journalist named Raviv Drucker uncovered this internal document from JNF, which lists dozens and dozens of settlements across the West Bank where JNF has invested resources. I think it's important to note when we think about the Drucker report, which got some press and attention in Israel, that some of the settlements that are listed there are places where JNF is building infrastructure in settlements, things like parks and bike paths. And some of these places, JNF is actually purchasing the land that the settlements are built on, including settlements that are quite far out in the West Bank. So it's a very kind of direct, immediate way that JNF is furthering settlement expansion and entrenchment. So we wanted to give a few examples of places in the West Bank where the JNF has been involved in particularly problematic work. This is in no way an exhaustive list. We would fill our entire time to this evening and more if we were to only give examples of difficult, problematic things that JNF has done, but to give you a bit of a sampling. In Silwan, which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, JNF has been involved in a legal case that has lasted for decades to try and evict a family by the name of Sumerin. JNF was able to acquire this property through an unjust application of what's called the absentee property law. And more broadly, JNF, in partnership with the settler organization Elad, for those of you who know, this is the organization that runs the City of David settler site. That organization has settled Israelis in at least 10 Palestinian properties in Silwan and has chosen to pursue evictions against several of these families. And JNF has worked with Elad since at least the mid-1980s, as we just talked about. Another example is that the Palestinian village of Susia in the South Hebron Hills is another place where the JNF has been active. You can see the image on this slide is from a JNF donations promotion booklet. And it points to Susia on this map as a place where it takes pride. Susia was once home to a whole Palestinian community, and the text on this JNF donation pamphlet calls it an attractive heritage site for visits, education, and a place for private and public events. Of course, that means only for Israelis and fully closed to the Palestinian residents who once lived there. JNF was also allocated land in the Efrat Regional Council and has been able to, and has advanced the construction of 800 settlement housing units in a very problematic area called E2 or Anachla, which is where the Givat Eitam outpost, which is unrecognized even by Israel now, stands. E2 is a particularly problematic area because it cuts off Bethlehem's growth from the south and could cut the southern West Bank into two. And the settlements there are really built on JNF's land itself. A few other quick examples just in passing. In Machrur, which is an area south of Jerusalem near Bethlehem in the occupied West Bank, JNF, through its subsidiary Himanuta, petitioned for the eviction and the demolition of the home and restaurant of the Kassia family. In Aramadin, JNF joined Regavim, which is a far-right settler group advocating for the demolition of Palestinian homes, in a case that sought the demolition of the entire village of Aramadin. JNF was also involved in purchasing Beit Bakri, which is inside the Palestinian city of Hebron, which is one of the most intense hotspots of occupation. You might have seen video clips coming out of this weekend of very intense settler violence inside of Hebron. Again, this is in no way an exhaustive list, but I think we try to pull different examples to give you a sense that everywhere you look in the occupied territories, you find JNF's footprint in building settlements, entrenching the occupation, whether it's in Sirwan in East Jerusalem, in Susia in the South Hebron Hills, in the Efrat area. The examples are rampant and are really geographically diverse.
So moving inside the green line, we can see similar cases in the north and the south, pretty much everywhere you look. So in the Negev desert, Kakal plans to plant a forest on top of the Bedouin village of Al-Araqib. Residents have refused to leave the village, which has led to the Israeli army demolishing this village actually over 200 times now. We should update this slide. At this point, it's over. Kakal is also complicit in the demolition of the Palestinian village of Al-Khiran, an effort to replace it with a Jewish town of a similar name. In the Galilee and the north, Kakal has worked to strategically purchase lands that will inhibit the growth and development of Palestinian towns. And as the board chair, Avram Duvdevani, explained, what they do is they intentionally outbid Arab buyers trying to purchase land in the Galilee in order to ensure that that land remains under Jewish ownership. A couple of examples from JNFs abroad. So JNF in Canada contributed directly to the construction of the hilltop settler outpost of Givat Oz Vegaon in Gush Etzion, a settlement block south of Jerusalem. There's been some major campaigning by groups like Independent Jewish Voices in Canada to oppose this kind of behavior and actions from JNF Canada. JNF USA donates to the David Horowitz Freedom Center, a group that is a recognized hate group, as well as to the settler site City of David in Silwan, which we just heard about, American Friends of Likud, American Friends of Shavei Hebron, and to the Gush Etzion Foundation.
Right. So we're going to transition now to talking about how Kakal JNF works. And as we think about that transition, I think something that's important to note is that inside of Israel, there's a lot of mainstream criticism of JNF for the issues of corruption and mismanagement. There was even a 2018 investigative report by the Israeli Justice Ministry, which recommended dissolving JNF because of issues of corruption and mismanagement, not because of the issues of entrenching the occupation, importantly. But I think for us, it's important to understand how organizational corruption and funding in the West Bank overlap and reinforce one another. So to say that in other words, because JNF has so many issues with mismanagement and with secrecy, it's led to tremendous spending in the West Bank that has had very little oversight. This includes a case in which 2 board members spent over 100 million shekels on purchases in the West Bank between 2017 and 2020, behind the backs of the rest of the board. We're not going to get into so much details about this case right now, but it's a good example, I think, of how having such an opaque and confusing structure of the organization meant that it was able to be easily exploited for nefarious political goals. And that the organization's very hazy structure made it possible for even millions of shekels to elude oversight. So because of this, understanding how Kakal JNF works, its organizational structure, its decision-making processes, its division of power, its budget, is really important if we're going to be able to counter the work that it's doing. It's really complicated, and part of this is very dry, and a lot of the report focuses on this into a level of detail that we're not going to be able to get to tonight. And I think it's interesting, Daniel and I interviewed dozens of people for this report, and not a single person who we spoke to, including board members of Kakal JNF, claimed to fully understand how the organization works. So I think that that's very telling. Part of that is because JNF is an 120-year-old organization that was created before the state and then brought into state infrastructure. And part of why it's so confusing is that that's part of the design, because confusion and having a really complicated system that's hard to understand serves the state's goals. We're getting into the very basics here. We're happy to delve deeper into any of the questions about how it functions in the Q&A. And you can also read the report, but that's sort of just a word of introduction about why it's important for us to start talking about these structures that may seem boring, but I think we think have a lot of impact in thinking about how to counter the work.
Okay, so here you see a kind of a very simple graphic of how these national institutions, these structures that we explained a little bit at the beginning, that Kakal JNF was created at the Zionist Congress in 1901. So these organizations all still are around, and they're all still related. And this is kind of how they sit. So the World Zionist Organization, it sits above these other three national institutions. But it's important to understand that though the map kind of looks like this in power structure, Kakal JNF has a budget that dwarfs all of the others, including the World Zionist Organization, even though it sits under the World Zionist Organization. So again, that's a body, the World Zionist Organization, that there's a Congress that meets every 5 years, and most recently in October of 2020, and they determine the leadership positions for all of these organizations, including Kakal. So that's where the current chairperson was named. They also determine a budget of $5 billion US, and they do a lot more. And it's important to say, so, if you've read about these organizations, you may have read that there's been a rightward shift in the national institutions. And it is true, but it's also true that these institutions were already carrying out exclusionary policies in Israel. It's noteworthy, for example, that the World Zionist Organization has financed illegal outposts in the occupied territories for years. So going back to the budget for a second, like I said, Kakal's budget dwarfs all of the other budgets. They're actually the most significant contributor to the budget of the WZO, the World Zionist Organization. So representation to the WZO and Kakal is decided by a complicated set of international organizations, world unions, representatives of the Israeli political parties that count themselves as Zionists. And all of this is determined through elections and negotiations in Israel and in communities around the world.
Great. So one thing that we've also mentioned in passing so far is that under Kakal JNF, there are two subsidiaries called Himanuta and Himanuta West Bank. Both of them act as purchasing arms for Kakal JNF. And I think one thing that's important to note is that Kakal JNF legally is what's called a public benefit company, but both Himanutas, both of these purchasing arms, are private companies and therefore have relatively little oversight. Just to clear up any confusion, in 2019, Kakal JNF began referring to Himanuta West Bank as Himanuta Jerusalem. This is just a nickname for Himanuta West Bank. It's not a new entity or its legal name in any way, and is actually purely a tactic to cover up the fact that Himanuta, quote unquote, Jerusalem is actually working in the West Bank. Looking now at this map of JNF's organizational structure, I want to just raise two notes about their finances. One is the point that Daniel mentioned in the introduction, which I think bears emphasizing when we think about how to counter their work, which is that 84% of JNF's profit is coming from real estate holding compared to the 4.5% that Daniel mentioned coming from donations. So I think that's like a really important gap to keep in mind in terms of thinking strategically. Another thing that we found in reading through many JNF financial reports is that they have not reappraised the value of their land. And so JNF documents say that their land, not including land belonging to Himanuta, is worth 3.7 billion shekels. And what we realize is that that's based on purchase value, meaning the value of the land at the time it was purchased. And based on calculations that we did that we're happy to talk more about, we estimate that the true value of the land is not 3.7 billion shekels like they're claiming, but something more like 250 billion shekels, which is 67 times more than they report. A former board member in an interview told us that the reason that they're aware of the fact that the land has not been reappraised, and the reason that they did this was in order to avoid government control, taxation, and things like that. And so I think kind of putting it in the financial context also shows the extent to which this is an organization with a tremendous amount of power.
So you can see here another quote from Avram Duvdevani, the chairperson. As long as the state of Israel exists, they will need JNF, which does things that the state does not do for one reason or another. So Kakal JNF has tried to portray itself like an NGO, like any other NGO, when it benefits them, but they have immense influence and access in Israeli halls of power. They actually make up 43%, so 6 of 14 seats on the Israel Land Authority Council. This is the highest authority that determines how land is used in Israel. Because Kakal JNF is tasked only with benefiting the Jewish people instead of all of its citizens, all of the country's citizens, it can do things that the state would have trouble justifying. So you're starting to get a sense of why Avram Duvdevani would say such a thing. So in return, Kakal gets a serious amount of power and resources from the state.
Next slide. Great. And I think to bridge between that, I think it's clear that the role of JNF is benefiting the interests of the state. One way we see this is that when the former board chair, Dani Attar, finally agreed to have more oversight over JNF, members of Knesset from Likud, which is a right-wing party, stepped in to thwart additional oversight because they realized that that the lack of oversight was good for their purposes of increasing land takeover in the West Bank. And so there's really this very mutually beneficial relationship between the state and the Jewish National Fund. To sort of drive home this point, the quote that we're about to read is from Kakal JNF's response to a 2004 court case when an NGO called Adala challenged the legality of the Israel Land Authority's land tenders, because since some of them belonged to the JNF, they were only allowed to be used for Jews. And Adala challenged this in court, saying it's not legal to have a land tender that can only be used for Jews. And in response, the JNF said, the JNF, in relation to being an owner of land, is not a public body that works for the benefit of all citizens of the state. The loyalty of Kakal JNF is given to the Jewish people, and only to them is Kakal JNF obligated. Kakal JNF, as the owner of Kakal JNF land, does not have a duty to practice equality toward all citizens of the state. So I think this is a good example of what people mean when they talk about apartheid within Israel and not only within the occupied territories. Kakal JNF is a body that sits on the Israel Land Authority, which is a public body of the state of Israel. It's a body that theoretically should be democratic and should be bound by non-discrimination principles between citizens. But because of its role on this council, Kakal JNF only leases land to Jews, and that means that equality is not a practice that is being practiced. There was a similar case, I think that's worth noting, in 2016, in which Adala, the same NGO, and the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, along with the Arab regional and local councils, challenged the place of Kakal JNF on the Israel Land Authority and argued that it was against the law that they should sit on a public body given their practices of inequality, and they lost the case. The court ruled that it was fine for them to continue and for these practices of inequality to continue as well.
Okay, so the third part of the report focuses on some of the different directions that activists could take in trying to oppose these discriminatory policies and actions. So the first one, as we spent a little time on, are thinking about the institutional power structures. So we found pretty early on in our research that that those national institutions have a lot of influence and connection to how Kakal JNF works and who decides which direction things go and where their budgets are allotted and sent and what they do. So one of the most important things is to think about institutional power structures and to actually, potentially think about taking part in or opposing inside these structures. So this is where the decision-making happens. So it must be that some activists are thinking about this sphere of influence when it comes to opposing Kakal JNF.
The second possible route that we could think about for action is the legal route. So JNF, the board has what's called a memorandum of association, and there's currently a debate on the board of Kakal JNF about whether or not this memorandum of association permits purchasing land in occupied territory. So the phrase under debate is that, quote, the Kakal JNF operates in the state of Israel in any area subject to the jurisdiction of the government of Israel. And the question is an area that's subject to the jurisdiction of the government of Israel, does that include occupied territory or not? Is that under Israeli jurisdiction? And that question about whether or not it's included in the memorandum of association is something that could be brought to the court system. It's something that would have to be thought about seriously because there could be an advantage to maintaining a sort of murky status quo rather than having the courts definitively rule against what we would want the interpretation to be. But a favorable ruling could be game-changing. And also even losing in court could actually be a media win and bring a lot of attention to the really problematic work of the JNF.
So yeah, the third, dismantling Kakal JNF. In many ways, the JNF land is treated as state land. As we just discussed, there's this real sort of benefit to both the state and to the JNF to thinking about the land as somehow one and the same, except when it comes to sort of the non-discriminatory, the rules of non-discrimination in the state. So JNF land is used to discriminate. So there's a logic to the idea that land that is treated as state land should be run by the state. So similar to other pre-state organizations that were dissolved or incorporated into the state of Israel after its founding, Kakal's land could be nationalized, its other activities could be transferred to the Ministry of the Environment, for example. This could have the effect of making some of the discriminatory policies harder to carry out, though not impossible, of course. Another route in the same vein could be a campaign to nullify the treaty between the state and Kakal. It's the 1961 treaty. So the vast majority of Kakal's budget comes from its real estate holdings. We've said this a few times. It's important to know when thinking about how to oppose them. And those real estate holdings are managed by the Israel Land Authority, which has almost half of its seats held by Kakal. So yeah, thinking about nullifying this treaty could have the effect of diminishing Kakal's power within sort of the state structures. If you want to go into the report, you'll see, though, this doesn't come without risk. Nullifying that treaty could free Kakal up to discriminate even more.
Great. So another arena for possible activism is in the international sphere. And although Kakal JNF on the ground receives relatively minimal funding from Jewish national funds abroad, it could still be useful to target these institutions because of the public impact this would have both on communities abroad and also on decision makers in Israel. There's a lot of ways this could be done. It could be through challenging the charitable status of various Jewish national funds abroad. It could mean pressuring international JNFs to cease donations to Kakal JNF, or to actually encourage the cessation of donations to JNFs abroad as well. Another arena to think about is, do you want to do activism on the ground?
Yes. Yes. Activism on the ground. For those who are able, there are a lot of ways to get involved in activism and organizing on the ground. Coming to Israel-Palestine with organizations like the organization that I am currently running called Center for Jewish Nonviolence, the Green Olive, with Green Olive Tours, connecting with folks here, first and foremost, Palestinian organizers and communities who are facing displacement daily. Palestinian-led organizations such as the Negev Coexistence Forum and Adala, both have been fighting legal battles for a long time, and other organizations and collectives who are working in solidarity and joining, coming to join on the ground is one direct way to have an impact.
And lastly is creating alternative institutions. One of the reasons that people argue that defunding or abolishing JNF is, or argue against doing that, is because they have a misguided perception of the organization doing important environmental work, which is how it brands itself. And there is some environmental work that it is doing, and JNF also does fund things like youth movements and other things that have value to them. And one way to counteract its power would be to build alternate institutions that serve similar functions, but center values of equity and of justice. This would mean creating institutions like something that Daniel and I are both involved in called the Kli Mechad Menach Wachad, which is a fight for climate justice here on the ground in Israel-Palestine for all people living between the river and the sea, and building out movements and organizations that center those values instead of the discriminatory values of JNF is one way that we can work to shift resources. So I think we'll just conclude by saying that it's really hard to think about how to challenge Kakal JNF. It is a huge and well-funded and difficult to understand organization, but I think we really believe that doing so is really, really crucial. The work of the JNF touches on all of the important issues in this land, on occupation, on settlement expansion, on the issue of Palestinian refugees, Bedouin communities, discriminatory legal frameworks. Name an issue and the JNF somehow has its hands in it. It really gets at the crux of justice and what it means to build a just society in this land. And I think that looking at the JNF is actually a really good way to think about how we can learn from them, that we can learn from the Jewish National Fund and from the right, that you really need to play the long game and be strategic. These are things that the JNF has done and taken in a direction that we think is really problematic, and we think it's time for us to do the same. Our hope is that this presentation and that the report more broadly are really a jumping off place for organizing both on the ground and globally about how to counter the work of the JNF. We hope the report is a small contribution towards those efforts. We really don't have, we listed a few arenas of possible involvement in activism. We don't have the full plan of how to bring down the JNF or how to redirect the JNF towards justice. But we hope that the information is useful to actually start conversations in communities around the world about how we can work together to do that. So thank you so much. We'd really love to be in conversation with all of you about how to actually do that. We're really happy to take questions now. I think we'll throw it back to Erez to facilitate that, but thank you so much to all of you.
Thanks to you, Daniel. That was incredible, and thanks so much for all your insight and the invaluable strategic analysis you give about how we can best potentially counter the discriminatory practices of the Jewish National Fund. We've had a bunch of excellent and worthwhile questions streaming in while you were talking, and for everyone who hasn't yet asked a question and wants to, please type it in the chat, and then we'll try to incorporate as many as possible. And I see it's come up several times. Is about the relationship between the JNF in Israel and the JNF in the United States, also between other JNF affiliates in South Africa, etc. Could you share more? And I think actually the last person I saw ask was Jerry. Jerry, do you want to ask your question to Maya and Daniel? I'll invite you to unmute now, if you're there. Otherwise, I can ask. Jerry Berentz, are you there? In that case, I'll just ask on his behalf and on behalf of the several others who asked similar questions, if you can just share a little bit more about the relationship between the. I know that there's a lot of discussion about the ways that JNF USA and other JNFs around the world try to distance themselves from the practices of the JNF in Israel. In what ways are they still complicit, or what do you see as the strategic relationship there?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. It's as with many things, that it's murky, and it's meant to be a bit murky. They're actually entirely different organizations from top to bottom. JNF USA and Kakal JNF are, one of them is a US-based NGO, and the other one is a Israel-based NGO, and they have different boards and they have different budgets. And for at least a few of the international JNFs around the world, primarily in the English-speaking diaspora, so the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, the JNFs sit apart. They're separate organizations. They have status in their own countries. In many cases, if not all, they're considered charities or nonprofits. But they all use the imagery and the name and the history of Kakal JNF. Most of them, including JNF USA, talk about being founded in 1901 or being 120 years old, talk about their long history of work on the ground, and sort of mix and match when it's convenient for them to be separate and when it's inconvenient for them to be separate. They want to fundraise off this image and off what I said early on about sort of the Jewish communal consciousness. But at the same time, in the last 20 years, in actuality, JNF USA, as a good example, had last year gave just 1% of their total fundraising intake to Kakal JNF projects. They give to many other projects in Israel. They give, but through Kakal JNF, they gave of $100 million approximately raised, they gave $1 million to Kakal JNF for joint projects. Another example of how you'll see sort of the history is used to create an image is with JNF UK. I haven't checked in the last couple of weeks, but until recently, you would go to the Q&A page on JNF UK's site, and you could see how they go out of their way to say that some years ago, JNF UK lost faith in how Kakal JNF was making use of their fundraised dollars. So at the same time, they're talking about their long 120-year history. They're talking about themselves as if they're one and the same, and simultaneously trying to distance themselves from this organization that we've heard for the last 52 minutes, all of the nefarious, discriminatory things that they do. So it's pretty much the same picture in most of those countries. I did say at the beginning there's 50 offices around the world. The vast majority of those offices are sort of satellites, fundraising offices for Kakal JNF directly. So they're a little different from the Canadian, the American, the UK, etc.
Thanks. And interesting to see the organizations, like the state, is trying to maintain a degree of ethical practice by distancing itself or creating a veneer with the JNF. Also, JNFs abroad try to maintain this while being complicit. But I'm just going to shift us to the other wonderful questions we have. I saw a question from Florian Zahler, who asked to hear more about environmental organizations on the ground here who are not complicit in the displacement of Palestinians. Florian, I'll ask you to unmute now if you want to ask the question yourself.
Yeah, hi there. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, first of all, thanks a lot to Maya and Daniel for the very great presentation. Yeah, I just can repeat my question. Are there any environmental organizations who are not complicit in the eviction of Palestinians? And are there maybe some organizations run by both Israelis and Palestinian people? Yeah, that was my question.
Great, thank you so much. That's a great question. So there are, and I think it's really important when we think about people who are donating to the Jewish National Fund to think about ways to redirect those donations to organizations that are doing joint solidarity and justice work. When we think specifically about environmental work, there's a lot of organizations that focus on solidarity more broadly and anti-occupation and Palestinian justice causes. Specifically in the arena of environmental justice, one that I mentioned is Aklim Echad Manach Wachad, which is the same words in both Hebrew and Arabic, One Climate, which is not a formal organization, is more of a movement of activists who the orienting philosophy is that we share one climate. And while there will be differential impacts because of climate change on different populations, and Palestinians will, on the whole, suffer much more quickly and in a much more significant way from the impacts of climate change, it's something that we're all responsible for and will all be impacted by. And so that's a group that does serious direct action and educational work around the environment and the ways that occupation and environmental justice reinforce each other and are part of a broader system. There's also organizations that support tree planting instead of in settlements in Palestinian communities. At different points, those have been run by different organizations. Tru'a is an organization that has had tree planting campaigns with Palestinian communities together. And I think another way to think about being involved in environmental justice on the ground is to actually be involved in what we call agricultural solidarity on the ground. So a lot of when Daniel mentioned being on the ground as a way to combat this work, part of what that means is working directly with rural Palestinian communities who bear the brunt of both climate change and settler violence in a way that really impacts the agricultural work, which is part of their subsistence. And activist and solidarity presence is one way of trying to help advance and ensure their own agricultural work.
Wonderful, thanks. And now I see here another question from Amy, who is asking about other recommendations for taking action. Maybe if there's something you haven't mentioned already, but Amy, I'll invite you to ask also yourself if you want to share.
Thank you. I had asked that question early in the presentation, so the suggestions here are super helpful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yes. In that case, I guess I just want to ask a question from.
Maybe just like since it opened up the question of like more to do, what is there to do? I saw above one of the questions was sort of about, so if JNF USA is really only giving a little bit of money relatively to Kakal, so how much impact does protesting them, for example, really have? And I think we touched on this earlier. what we found, we were also surprised to find such that so much of the budget of Cacao comes from real estate holdings and so little from fundraising and from international fundraising at that. But like we said earlier on, it's really important not to think that means that protesting your JNFs in your home countries won't have any effect. Exactly because they tie up their history and imagery in the history and imagery of Cacao as a whole. The protesting, raising awareness, opposing charitable status, all of these actions can chip away at that enormous amount of cultural sway that the JNF has. Again, for example, in our upbringing, for Maya and I. And so it really does go a long way. If it's not impacting their budget in an enormous way, it is impacting the culture in an important way.
Yeah, and one last thing to add to that is something that we discuss in more depth in the report is that there are other organizations that operate in the US that sit on the board of Cacao JNF and have a pretty direct impact on the decision-making processes of Cacao JNF. So, for example, Maccabi is an organization that runs sports tournaments mainly in diaspora Jewish communities. They work out of many Jewish community centers. They have a seat on the Cacao JNF board. The same is true of Hadassah, which is a women's organization. A lot of organizations that I think many people think of as fairly apolitical sit on the Cacao JNF board, and protesting or advocating within those organizations and trying to use leverage there can actually be a way to pretty directly affect Cacao JNF on the ground here.
Incredible. I see, Nabil, you've raised your hand. I think we'll take one last question from everyone here. Maybe I'll close with one more after that of my own, and then we'll close out this incredible conversation. Nabil, I'll invite you now to ask your question.
Actually, it's not a question, it's just a statement. Hang on, excuse me a second here. Hang on. I've got you on two. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, if you can hear me, I just want to tell you, for those of you guys interested in environmental issues as far as Palestine is concerned, you should follow Mazen Kumsiya. I don't know how many guys know of Mazen, but he's an extreme activist and environment for Palestine. Extremely active and extremely knowledgeable. Mazen, I put it in the chat. I hope I spelled his name correctly. Let me see if I hit enter yet or not. Hang on. Yeah, I think I just put it there. So look him up. His work is fantastic. He's very knowledgeable. Most of his work is around the environmental issues of Palestine. So just a statement. Oh, and by the way, are you going to be sharing the video and the recording and the PowerPoints?
I'll have to ask and make sure about the PowerPoint, but yes, we'll of course be sending the recording, and we want as many, and I'll also be sending that recommendation. As both you just made clear and Maya and Daniel have noted, there are many people who are stewarding land here with a much more democratic vision than the KKL-JNF, and it's really important to highlight their work, so appreciated. Maya and Daniel, I guess I just want to close with a last question that's more personal for you both, and just ask, as you've undergone this process and as you understood more and researched so intensely the workings of the JNF over the last year, I guess I'm just curious if there's anything else that really most surprised you or that you think is really most important to drive home about what the nature of this organization and structure is and what it means ethically and for those of us concerned with a democratic future.
I think, coming into thinking about the questions that this report raised first, So thinking about how we were going to approach our research, I think we understood, or I speak for myself, understood that Cacao is doing a lot of bad stuff. That we had encountered it over many years as activists here on the ground, and even previously in between that upbringing that Maya described and embarking on this research. But I think sort of understanding just how enormous a body it is, just how much land it owns, just how much impact it has on other enormous institutions, how much it's doing in occupied territory on both sides of the Green Line, the kind of very public and clear ways in which from the outset, from the early years of the state, you can find people saying out loud how Cacao has worked to displace Palestinians, to create an apartheid reality, and how successful it's been in these decades in doing that in such an enormous and central way to the state. I think I remember when we were sort of coming to the conclusion of our research and thinking about some of the titles of sections, and we were thinking about something that someone had said to us, that Cacao is really a state within a state, and so you'll see that as a sort of section heading, but it really that can't be said too clearly, with too much emphasis. It is really this massive arm creating discriminatory, apartheid, oppressive reality here.
I would echo all of that, and only add that I think the work of the JNF is so multifaceted that I think the main conclusion that it led me to is that our response also has to be tremendously multifaceted. And we presented several paths. There's also several more, some of which are in the report, some of which are probably beyond it. And the answer isn't going to be one of them. The answer is going to be some strategic combination of many of them. And I think that means that we all really have a role in this struggle, that there's a specific angle that it's really important for communities around the world to play. There's a particular role that it's really important for people on the ground to play. There's a particular role that people who are inside of institutions need to play. And there's a particular role that people who are activists and working grassroots movements also need to play. And we need to be working together and having conversations. And so I think that's why these kinds of gatherings are so exciting for me, and I think for us, to be able to share that work. And we really do hope that you'll take a look at the report and share it with your friends and communities, and help us spread this conversation and be partners in this work. So thank you so much.
Thank you both for taking the time, really, and for inviting us into this work, for giving us an array of different options for strategic action, engagement, and advocacy that we can participate in to counter the JNF and create a more ethical reality here in Israel-Palestine. I think with that, I'll close and just say a few last words, and say on behalf of everyone at Green Olive, and of course, at If Not Now, I assume also that we're very thankful everyone came for this important conversation. As I said at the start, this can seem abstract when we're sitting on Zoom, and it's important to center that people's lives and communities are on the line, and find ways that we can act against the structures and policies of displacement that exist in Israel-Palestine. Coming together for a webinar doesn't by itself end all the injustice here, but informing ourselves and educating ourselves is a meaningful and powerful step. If you want to engage further and continue educating yourself, you can follow Green Olive, and of course, If Not Now, on social media. And as I said at the beginning, if you want to help Green Olive sustain its future work and create future platforms for publicly accessible advocacy and education, you can do so at this link, greenolivetours.com/contributions. It would be incredibly appreciated. And as mentioned, we will donate 10% of all proceeds to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. In very last closing, I just want to invite everyone to have wonderful days, to join us for future programming, and to look out for the work of Maya and Daniel, and if not now in the future. If you're ever in the region, please do join Green Olive for our tours. And look out for our next webinar next month. A week before Christmas, we'll be having a panel discussion featuring Christian Palestinian perspectives on liberation and occupation. So thank you all so much. Have lovely rest of your days, and thank you for joining.